tourist town. And he owned a small hotel and restaurant. And we stayed there till we left the town in January of '49. So I spent 6 years there, because I was 9 when we left, 9.5, got there when I was 3.5. Actually, I think my parents tried to make my life, and I had a little brother later on, as normal as possible. I really had a pretty good childhood, which might sound amazing to you, because, you know, we were away from big cities, they were not Hitler sympathizers, so it was a tourist town. Nobody wanted to really bomb us. However, the air raids did start. You know, we had an air raid often. And the town was so small that we as a family would go into the woods because it was surrounded by woods and hills. And winter and summer. You know, I remember my mother in the winter pushing my little baby brother in a carriage through the snow. I guess the older I got, I knew that this wasn't a good thing, especially being pulled out of bed late at night, but middle of the night. And my father always stayed behind, which was the common thing. I thought later in life, you know, what would he have done if a bomb had fallen? He couldn't have upheld the building, but that's what he did. So that was not, you know, I realized that this was something that could come from above that wouldn't be too good. But you forget about it as a child. I mean, you don't delve on that. So life went on, and really it was about 1944. It was, no. Yeah, it was early 44. They didn't arrest my father, it being a small town, but they called him in for questioning. And like I said, he was probably not drafted in the German army because he had been in World War I. They didn't like something. He was fairly successful with his business. So instead of saying Heil Hitler, which I never saw him do, but in a public building, in a business, you had to raise your hand or arm and say Heil Hitler. Well, my father didn't. He got away with this for many years. He would say good evening, you know, good afternoon, whatever. And someone complained about it. So there was sort of an administration. We were in a tiny square across the street from us, and for about, it was winter, for about 2-3 days he had to go there. And they would question him. I don't know what they ask him anymore, or did I know then. But I knew it was serious. A child can tell just by the way, you know, the atmosphere is, and your parents are tense. I didn't like it, and my mother would peep from behind the curtains because we were right across. But he came back, and believe it or not, I think the reason he was not arrested and we weren't sent to, God forbid, a concentration camp is because someone who was a party member was a fairly good friend of, he was a good friend of my father's, and he put in a good word for him. So, you know, this was 44. You'd think they'd have other things to worry about. The war ended in May of 45, but, you know, it's crazy. So, what happened next? Well, I mean, I absorbed the tension somewhat because my parents knew, they were the best parents, but they knew nothing about child psychology. So they would talk in front of me. One thing that stands out in my memory is you couldn't say, you know, that you were against the regime. That's how it is under socialism. And we had a lot of help in the hotel. A few lived in the hotel. So if you wanted the real news, because the Nazi news on the Goebbels was all propaganda. We were always winning the war when we really weren't. So if you wanted to know anything, in our living room we had a radio. She would sit, because anybody could report you. She would sit with her ear glued to the radio. And you got the real news, you know. We were losing all over the place. They won a few battles. The war was terrible, and from then on, 44 on for sure, maybe before my father said, there's no way they're gonna win that war. You know, Russia, it was insane to go into Russia. Nobody goes into Russia and wins a war like they used to fight a war. I mean, Napoleon didn't. He had to retreat, and the Germans got stuck in there, and they lost a big division there. They starved to death. I think it's Stalingrad. Well, and then 45 rolled around. That's when the war came home. And I mean, we were lucky where we were living. My father did a good thing moving us where he did. So it was in April. Seemed to think it was around the 10th for some reason. I always remember that. That it was actually Patton's army came through our area. And before we all retired, we could hear the bombing of the next big city, you know, just boom, boom. So we didn't sleep in our beds. My father had reinforced the cellar. And there were quite a few people down there, like an old couple who were guests who didn't want to go back home to their city. They wanted to be where it was a little safer. So the whole family, some help, we all went down there, and we spent the whole night. Of course, they did come through. We were not bombed. It was mainly artillery fire. And of course, a lot of tanks that we heard rolling. And they did shoot at buildings. Our building, which was about 3 stories high, was shot at. Because, you know, they were always suspecting that there were some stragglers around who would fight them. So all of a sudden, the next morning, I think it was daylight, everything got quiet as a mouse. And I remember that night, my father saying, just in general, you know, we're safe down here. You know what cellars are like? They're terrible. There was the basement. They stored vegetables down there. They had a big oven to heat the building, but we weren't in that section. The windows were high. And my father said, we are safe here, unless the building, you know, gets so much damage and stones come down that everything over there was built with stones that you can't get out those windows anywhere. And he said the next big danger, I don't know why he told everybody that would be if there was a gas leak, God forbid. But that didn't happen. So it was very quiet, and after a little while, we heard the piano playing in one of the dining rooms. And my father said, well, I better go upstairs and see what's going on. And somebody yelled at him, wave a white handkerchief, you know, so they don't shoot you. Of course, you know, at that age, and I was just getting close to being 6 years old, you understand that there's a big danger. You can't put it all together, but you do understand. And, you know, we waited anxiously, and then after a while, he came back down. Now, I don't know how they conversed. My father did not know English. Most of the Americans didn't know a word of German, but they let him know that we had to get out of the building. We lived in the building. It was our home. We lived there those 6 years. Had I been in my bed, my regular bed, which was sort of a youth bed, I would have probably been dead because there was machine gun fire all through the headboard, what was at the bottom. So they might have gotten me. But they didn't, because I was way down under the building. Okay, so we had to get out. I mean, what they were going to do, believe it or not, it was Patton's army, by the way.
I got it.
Yeah.
You good.
They were going to, we figured out, they set up headquarters there because the place had a huge backyard. And they set up headquarters, and of course, we were the enemy, right? So they said, get out. It was not really, what we wanted to do. Now, in the building itself, all the windows had come out of the building, and they had concrete balconies facing the front of the building. Some of those, the stones lay on the terrace. I mean, it had some damage, but you could live there. So we had to go. So my parents always had, not a little red wagon, but a little wooden wagon ready that you pulled with some suitcases on there. And my mother, when she came upstairs, my brother was only 10 months old, I think. She made a big deal with this American soldier. She had to go in the kitchen and get some baby bottles. And of course he didn't know what she was saying. I don't know if he ever figured it out. But she finally got some baby bottles. And we went out the back. And when we went out the back, my grandmother was with us. I think actually that's the first time in my life that something just came over me. Like a really sickening, bad feeling. Up till then, like I said, my parents provided us with a fairly good childhood, and it was a very beautiful little town. So, I almost sometimes didn't know there was a war. Okay, so we left. It was a terrible feeling. It's the first time I felt truly, truly sad in my life. So then we went around the long block because they had some friends at the other end who owned a cafe, and they were going to take us in, but then they decided to come back. We crossed in the front of our building. There was a side street, and right next door was a small grocery and sort of a semi-farmer, and they took us in. So we could see everything that was going on. The Americans set up little houses in that backyard. They had at least 3, looked like little huts for communications and what have you. So we were out. Now, the remarkable thing is, believe it or not, and I'm telling it to you like it was, like I remember it, the Americans were rather nice. I can't say that they weren't. The funny thing is, nobody told me I couldn't go play outside. Oh, that first night I was scared because the people didn't have that much room. So we ended up being in what they used as storerooms, but you went up on the outside, sort of like a motel, which don't have much in Germany at that time, and then you went into a door. Okay, so my mother put my brother and I, and he was no comfort to me at his age, into this room and proceeded to lock the door from the outside. And I screamed and hollered, and I said, don't leave us here. Of course that was to no avail. She did. And I cried myself to sleep, and I could hear the tanks moving and all that commotion. And I said, my God, what if something happens to my parents? That was my big worry. It didn't. So after that night, I think I slept better. And before I knew it, I was outside, playing outside in the street. The Americans gave us chewing gum as kids. They gave us chocolate bars. We thought that was great because you didn't get much chocolate in Germany towards the end of the war. A little bit from Switzerland because it was always neutral. So we had our chocolate. We were happy. And they were nice to us, And oh my goodness, they gave my father cigarettes, which is something, he was a big smoker. You couldn't get cigarettes, or you got the substitute, which I'm sure he didn't like. So one night, it was still daylight, it happened in April. We were going into spring and summer. We walked around this big old block, and I think the Americans were giving away so much chocolate and chewing gum and nylon stockings to girlfriends, you know. And of course the German young women hadn't seen a man in ages. They were all in the German army. So that they finally told them not to give all their rations away. But they couldn't just hand it to them like they had been. So we took this long walk, and all of a sudden, it was just my parents and I. My father said, Kristina, that's a, you know, it means Kristina. He said, go ahead. He said, that American is dropping cigarettes for me. That was his way of getting them to my dad. So I would pick him up, you know. Okay, so that was fine. So that went on till I think they were still had their headquarters there, but they let us back into the building, I'd say end of July. We couldn't stay in the rooms we had occupied to sleep, so we had to move to another section that had windows, but we were back home, so to speak. Of course, food was scarce, everything was scarce. And I don't want to forget anything here. Where am I? They let us back in. The war ended officially, as you might know, I think May 8th, but this was after that. It was probably end of July. I hope you're not bored with this. I mean, I wasn't in a concentration camp, okay? I had heard the word. I even had heard the word as a child, Siberia, like when they were questioning my father. Or after, I don't know. So, yeah, my father tried to pick up the pieces and start from scratch, I guess, in a way. It wasn't as scratched as it got to be, because we still had the Deutschmark as the money. And then the 4 Allied leaders, I don't have to tell them who they were.
They're in U.S. history right now.
Right, so that you would know who they were. They met, and Stalin, wanted a larger area. Then, you know, Germany was divided into 4 zones, but he claimed he deserved a little more land area because, you know, Germany was, and I admit it, I mean, I'm in this country now, I'm an American. You know, the German army was very hard on the Russians and the population in Russia, and he wanted payback, and he told the Allied leaders, the others, he said, I don't want you to take Berlin. I'm taking Berlin, and he did. And of course, Berlin, which I've never been there. My father worked there a long time when he was young, learning his trade. You know, was just rubble. So he took it, and then they did give him more area, more land area. Still 4 zones. He wasn't bigger than the other 3 zones, but he was probably had the biggest zone. And guess who went into that area? Who fell into that area? The Americans withdrew, and we got the Russians. Because we were all east, central Germany east. I guess it had something to do with it. Oh my goodness. I mean, the people were more upset than when the Americans came. I mean, they were petrified. Petrified. When they marched in, now we were lucky, they weren't fighting anymore. We got, you know, they marched in and occupied us, but every person. There was not one soul on the streets. There was a side staircase on that entrance. You come in this way, and then you go down a few steps here, and it was kind of a little bit secluded. And yours truly had the nerve to stand out there and watch the Russian army march in. It was a spooky feeling. Okay, so they settled in. I think they stayed in the hotel a while too, because they had a cook there who would ask me, he'd hold up an onion, and he would ask me the German word for it. He was desperately a Russian trying to learn German. So that went on. They would bang at the door late at night, when my father had locked up, banging like the devils. And you had to go down and open up. So you opened up, and all they wanted to drink. And my father gave him every last bottle of wine, of alcohol that he had. He ran out. Then they started bringing their own stuff, vodka, I guess mainly, And believe it or not, I was scared of the Russians, like I'm sure many were scared of the Germans. I was very afraid of them, but you know what? They're people too. The regular man that was in the army was a person. He had loved ones at home in Russia. They're not monsters per se. So, that was a big deal with the drinking, and they eventually liked my dad, they'd slap him on the back and they'd say, drink with us, and if you didn't drink with them, you made an enemy, and you didn't want to make an enemy. It seemed like they had a little bit short tempers. So he finally, if it was in daytime, he'd tell the waiter, bring me water. I can't drink all that vodka like they do. I'd be under the, South Town. So, okay, so we lived with them from September of 45 till January of 49. I have lived under both Nazis, national, whatever, what is the party name?
Yeah, the National ASP, an ASP.
Socialist something? I don't know.
They call it the Workers' Party. Yeah. Socialist, but it's a different type of social.
Yeah.
It's not the same as
In other words, you don't have all your freedoms. Like I said, you could not speak against the government at all. You could be arrested. I mean, God knows, too many Jewish people died in the Holocaust. I mean, that's a nightmare. But there were quite a few Germans in prison too who stood up against the regime that were in prison. You didn't have to do much wrong before they picked you up and put you there. And that often was a death sentence right then and there. It was very sad. Actually, I didn't know about all that then. And like I said, I was 9.5, and I think when I started school at the age of 6, it was not talked about, ever. Because the teachers, everybody was traumatized by the war too, and you didn't talk about the war. So I didn't know any of that, and I didn't know, about the Jewish situation at all. However, I'm going to tell you the truth. There was one time, and I'm remembering now, this is before, the Americans ever came through, that, no wait, it must have been when the Americans came through, yes. There was a concentration camp, not Dachau and not Auschwitz, and there's another one I can't think of right now. It wasn't that huge or that important, but it was a concentration camp in another town not far from us, and we didn't even know it. Under a dictatorship, under extreme socialism, they keep everything from you. You live in darkness in a way. All I remember is after the Americans liberated that camp, they printed a book very quickly on the atrocities, a paperback, and all I remember is my mother sitting in a corner, crying for 2 days, reading that book, just sobbing. And my father finally took the book from her and said, that's enough, You can't just sit here and cry the rest of your life. Okay, that was that. And actually, I didn't know about that camp till, I must have been 40s or 50s. I'm 83 now. My husband used to watch documentaries on the war too, because, you know, he loved history. And I couldn't even look at some of the stuff, especially about concentration camps. I can do it now, I guess, because I've adjusted to the fact that it did happen. But at that point, this camp was mentioned. When they mentioned Ortrup, I said, my God, that wasn't but 8 kilometers from us, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers. Wasn't far away. Everybody knew it was there. They kept everything secret. Okay, so now we're under the Russians. I went to school under the Russians because you had no freedoms either. And one thing they did right away, they said the money is useless. I don't think they did that in the other 3 zones, but your money is useless. They issued 100, whatever the money was, East German money, to every household. So my father got $100. Well, whatever the money was. I mean, dollars would have probably been worth more. And since my grandmother lived with us, she also got $100. So he started his life's work over with $200. And, you know, he did a little bit. I mean, people came to eat now and then. I mean, it's amazing that how horrible things get. You still have people who, you know, sometimes out of necessity, maybe they had no one at home to cook for them. That would, of course, business wasn't thriving, but it was running. I forgot what year it was. I was 7-ish. And May Day is a huge holiday in Russia. I mean, they celebrate it. You know, they pull out all the weapons, munition, and they have parades with the Russian soldiers, and they show off their strength. And not for that reason, but May Day is the beginning of spring over there, and it's just a big day for Germans too. Now this is while we were under the Russians. So one May Day, the kids in the village, or it was a little town, we might have been 10,000 inhabitants, I don't remember. We were asked to do little skits in the little square in front of our building, and I did. I don't remember what I did, but my mother dressed me all up, and there I went. And afterwards, a Russian came to my father and said, you know, we could really make your daughter's life successful. I mean, I'm not trying to win any contest here, but I guess they thought I was a pretty little girl, and I would, you know, they could train me into something. But, you know, they owned a part of the city of Berlin too. It was 4 zones in itself. And they said if he would, in other words, at that young age, 7 or 8, I would not live at home anymore. They would take over, and you become really a part of the state. And maybe I could come home for Christmas, I don't know, but he told them flat no. Anyway, he decided he didn't want to raise his children. My aunt, who lived in New Orleans, had come over to the States in 1924. She sent us care packages, you know, all the time. And that helped a lot because for a long time, you couldn't get flour. You couldn't get this, you couldn't get the other. And she would send them to us. And she had to weigh it exactly before the post office in New Orleans would take it. We never got a package that you'd be surprised at the turncoat Germans. The ones who hailed Nazis and Hitler the biggest, guess what? They were now the biggest communists. Or East German, eventually they called them fascists, Stazis. And every package was opened. As I remember it, because she had to include a list, they didn't take too much out, but you were checked. anytime you live under a system like that, you're checked. Everything about you is checked. Every letter that we got was opened and read. What do? That helped us a lot. So I think it was 1947, my father asked my aunt, could we come to this country? He didn't want to raise his children like that. And she said, yes, I'll sponsor you, that's fine. So now, how to get out? Oh, he went to Berlin. I guess you do a lot of wishful thinking. He went to Berlin, I guess to a Russian embassy or something. Oh, I mean, you think about it. Does anybody leave Russia even now? Unless they get out by some trick of some kind? You don't just voluntarily leave. So he realized that wouldn't work.